Good evening, everyone, and we are very thankful for you being here tonight. We are going to start a new cycle for 2023 between Mexico of the International Federation of Translators, Interpreters, and Terminologists of North America. And to begin with this, we have the great honor and privilege of having someone from abroad, from outside of our region, so that this person knows the way in which we are working, and so that this person knows that we are an inclusive. And we have Marsel de Souza.
I would like
Marsel
to give the floor to our president in FIT North America. Alan Melby, would you please welcome us?
Sergio, thank you very much. Well, FIT North America is alive and well, thanks in great measure to our Mexico chapter leader. Sergio, thank you. And you know, who was it who said, this was a long time ago, the news of my demise, of my death, the news is greatly exaggerated.
Not me.
Somebody said that, some famous author. And so I would like to say that all the news you're hearing about everybody, pretty much everybody being replaced by Chat GPT, the news about the demise of our profession is greatly exaggerated. We are alive and well, and we'd like to have you think about our conference in October in Monterey. It's on our website. We'll send this out. We can send this out to people later. It's shaping up. We've got keynote address speakers, including Sergio. You're one of our keynotes there. And and we're going to be talking about educating the next generation of translators, terminologists, and interpreters. And now I'm looking forward, very much looking forward to this webinar on this connection between the major events in the history of interpreting. Thank you so much. And thank you, Sergio, for organizing this. And thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you. And I have some news for you and for everybody. AMETLI, the Asociación Mexicana de Traductores Literarios, has a new board. So, well, long live the ex-former king and long live the new queen for AMETLI.
And for him to give you the welcome, Ernesto Zavala, he's the president of CEMIC.
Okay, so I'm going to do this in English because I thought this was going to be all in English, so I might as well. Good evening, hello. It's an honor as chair of the board of the Mexican Association of Conference Interpreters to be able to welcome you to this webinar called From Nuremberg to Wuhan, presented by Marsel de Souza. This is one of the webinars that Sergio Alarcón, chapter chair for FIT North America, Mexico, has put together to include as part of a series to provide interesting content to all the members of FIT and anyone who sees the great value these seminars provide. We hope that everyone agrees that this is a most interesting discussion. Enjoy. Thank you, Marcel. Thank you, Sergio.
Thank you. And finally, before we give Marcel the big round of applause, Monica Ibarra, she's a representative of CEMIC before La FIT North America. Good evening, Monica. Thank you, Sergio. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this series of conferences. We have as guest speaker, Marsel de Souza. He is member of the FIT LATAM chapter. But we include them as well in our geographical space that we share in the American continent. Thank you, Ernesto, for your words. Thank you, Sergio, for organizing this. Alan, it's great to have you here with us. And without any further ado, I want to give the floor to Marcel. Thank you. So we'll be expecting you soon. And okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well. And I hope that the interpreters are hearing me well too, that we can start. Just 1 second, please. I would like to tell you that we have interpretation from Portuguese into English, Spanish, and French. They're all members, or they're participating in a way in the CEMIC, and we have also 2 recently graduates. I want to thank our team, Mariela Andrade, Gabriel Beneman, Gabriela Clefi, Francisco Javier López Islas, Lorena Rincón del Ángel, Ana Cortés, Octavio Vallejo, and Diana Ungay. The floor is yours, Marcel. Thank you so much, Sergio. I want to take this time to thank you for the invitation. I want to thank the Mexican College of Conference Interpreting for their invitation. I want to thank FIT North America. It is a pleasure to be here opening this series of conferences. It's a very big honor. Thank you for the invitation, and I hope to contribute something useful for you tonight. I'm going to try and speak slowly to help my colleagues, interpreters here with me. Can we please put on the slides? Okay, so just to put you in context, my presentation was created in the Congress of Lafitte in Varadero, Cuba in 2022. So these slides that I'll be sharing with you are the same slides that I have presented last year. It was the presentation in English. This is why the slides are in English. However, I have made some modifications because I updated it. Just very quickly about me. I'm from Brazil. I'm from Brasilia, actually. I'm graduated by the University of Brasilia. I studied letters, translation and English in the UNB. And so other than being an interpreter, I'm a translator as well. I'm member of 2 entities in Brazil. I'm member of ABRATES, the Brazilian Association of Translators, and the APIC is the Association of Conference Interpreters. I'm also a member of AIC and of the ATA in the United States, and I'm one of the founding fathers of LLC Interpreters and Translators in my home country, in my home city, Brasilia. So this is about me. This is just a general way, but I'm going to start now with my presentation. I'm very interested on history in general terms, and from some time, what has interested me the most is the history of our profession. So the first contact I had with our profession was in 2004, the first annual Congress of the ATA, where I participated in Toronto, in Canada. And this gentleman that you see here next to me, you can see my face, how proud I am of being there, standing next to this man, next to this gentleman. It is because he's one of the Nuremberg interpreters. His name is Peter Les. Mr. Peter Les was a German interpreter in 1945 in Nuremberg. Afterwards, he migrated to the United States. He didn't continue with his career as an interpreter, but rather he pursued law, and he passed away some years ago. I'm not sure when, but he's no longer with us. I'm going to jump now to 2019, when because of the establishment of the foundation of our association, that 100 years, I spoke in ABRATES in Sao Paulo, and there I presented a landscape of the 100 years of the conference interpreting. 1990, It's our framework when World War One finished and the creation of the League of Nations as the initial framework for our profession. Next one, please. Let's see. It was precisely after World War One, just to put you in context, before I begin to talk about a very interesting topic as well, which is the Nuremberg period, but from 1945 up to tonight, to today. But I want to put you in some context so that you know what happened before the Nuremberg trials. So when the end of World War One came, they created the League of Nations. This is the precursor of the UN. And there they established that the official languages would be English and French. And this generated a great demand, not only for interpreting, but also for translation. So this means that this just created entity suddenly started to bring not just internal interpreting teams, but also a group of translators. Back then, the modality of interpretation that existed was the consecutive interpreting. We didn't have the concept of simultaneous interpreting back then, because the equipment that we used to do this simultaneous interpreting wasn't available at the time. This is why we used to say that the pre-Nuremberg period means it's the golden age of the consecutive interpreting. There were situations that we wouldn't think of considering many of our current standards. For example, there would be a person coming to speak to the League of Nations, and this person would be speaking for 30 or 40 minutes without even stopping for a second. The interpreter will be taking notes for 30, 40 minutes, and afterwards, the interpreter would start with the interpretation, and the speaker would just leave to the next meeting, and this speaker would just leave the interpreter there doing his or her interpretation for 30, 40 minutes more, just so that you realize what was the status of consecutive interpretation at that time. Now, this doesn't mean that there was no wish to move on to a different modality, but they didn't know what could be that change that could be more efficient than the consecutive interpreting. Next one, please.
E aí, para a gente chegar ao que foi Nuremberg, né? Muitas.
And there, in order to get to what Nuremberg was, if you know the history of our profession, you may have an idea. Maybe you know that simultaneous interpreting is with headsets, with a booth, and that it just emerged like that in an instant during the Nuremberg trials. In the trials of those war crimes in 1945, when this wasn't the case. It was actually a process. There was an evolution up to Nuremberg. There were a lot of experiments before that with very cheap equipment. They tried to do a booth, but it was very complicated. They had very rudimentary equipment, but then it became the standard. And that's the moment where we got to Nuremberg, when in the League of Nations, there was some understanding about how consecutive interpreting should be. Remember, there were two official languages, English and French. And at that point, all of the meetings, all of the discussions, all of the documents that they would generate had to be in English and then French. And they needed to interpret this. So there was an awareness that in terms of time management, it wasn't as the most efficient thing to do, because they needed to put in half of the day for a language and then the other half of the day for the other language. Through this situation would generate even more complications in other forms that were emerging. For example, in the International Organization of Work, the OIT, which formed also in 1990, they would have another even greater problem there because they were multilingual at that time. They had already many other languages. And for example, in other places in the world, in Moscow, the International Communist, which was the confederation of the parties around the world that was emerging, it was also a multilingual organization. And so for them, consecutive interpretation was a great challenge, and it generated greater problems. So they really wanted to overcome this paradigm, and it was precisely in the Nuremberg trials when we came to the format that would later became the simultaneous interpreting for conferences. Truth is that it would have been completely new to try and do consecutive in Nuremberg because they had 4 languages other than German, English, French, and Russian. So if they were to use the consecutive modality, the trials would have lasted maybe years. And on top of that, I'm sure the result wouldn't have been the same. And in terms of efficiency, I'm sure they would have sacrificed something at some point. So now this dynamic was completely innovative, and they were trying to integrate in 1945 simultaneous interpreting. It was not just something that was well received back then, rather they had some resistance to it. There was some skepticism, some people wouldn't believe in this, so because the consecutive modality was very well received. They have already reinforced this quite well during these 2 decades that it was used. So interpreters, who were the ones that we used the service, they believed that simultaneous interpreting wouldn't be possible at all, that there was no way in which the brain of an interpreter could process all of this. And so they would give them funny nicknames to the interpreters. They will call them parrots or birds. So, but in any way, they would do the trials completely in a modality of simultaneous interpreting, just as we'll continue to see throughout this presentation. And even so, it was needed to overcome that skepticism and that resistance in the upcoming years. It is important to understand this. In 1945, during the trials and with that experiment and that ongoing experiment, because it was an experiment, simultaneous interpreting, but they didn't have an idea of having a team of interpreters there at that point. They didn't know that they were making history. It was for those first simultaneous interpreters that started so many years ago, the perception was very different because, just as I said before, there was a lot of resistance, a lot of skepticism, a lot of uncertainty on how this profession would work, what would be the new paradigm, or how could one develop such profession, something that was very important for these simultaneous modality to get stronger. It was when the UN adopted it in 1947, the simultaneous interpreting. After World War II, the League of Nations stopped working, and then we have the UN, which adopted simultaneous interpreting as its standard. Those first years were very difficult what happened was that they started they started to have more events, more meetings, and of course, the number of languages also grew. And there was a very important event in 1953 when they created AIC, the International Association of Conference Interpreters. Actually, 2023 would be the 70th anniversary of AIC. AIC will be turning 70 years of its existence, and it came along with a very important mission, and it was to put order in all of this mess that they had back then. That growth, that speedily growth of the demand of this new interpreting modality didn't have any type of parameters. It didn't have any type of standards or regulations. And this is why AIC emerged as the world reference to dictate the parameters of our profession. Now, I have to say that consecutive interpreting continued to be an option for the UN up until the beginning of the 70s, I believe, up until 1971. So it was more than 2 decades, as you can see. And even so, the person who was coordinating a meeting could decide, you know what, for this meeting, we want simultaneous or consecutive interpreting. It was their choice, the choice of the person organizing the meeting. So as you can see, both modalities coexisted for a long time. However, from then on, the simultaneous interpreting modality was the one that prevailed. So this takes us to 2020. The year 2020, where we have a unexpected situation, and it was unexpected from the general point of view and specifically from our profession, the COVID-19 pandemic. Now we can do some parallelisms between the events that happened more than 75 years ago. And I was reflecting at that point of the pandemic. I was reflecting and I felt very impacted because I had already started studying the history of our profession, but you don't know how much I was impressed by all the parallelisms that there were between all the situations. In 1945, the dilemma was the time constraint. The trial, the court, they couldn't just multiply by 4 the duration of each hearing, of each testimony. In 2020, our constraint was in time, rather space. We face a situation in which suddenly we couldn't get together. We couldn't be at an auditorium, at a meeting, a conference room, sorry. So we started realizing that the situation wasn't going to resolve just in a couple of weeks. We also realized that events, seminars, conferences, meetings that were, being postponed couldn't just happen because there was no deadline for the pandemic to be over. So it was needed to generate a solution, and the only solution was remote interpreting, which wasn't actually something new. It wasn't actually something that was invented in 2020, which brings us to the next parallelism with 1945. Simultaneous interpreting in 1945 it wasn't either a novel concept, because the concept already existed, but the only thing was that it wasn't applied at large scale yet, because the experiments and the testing that they have done up to that time would propose a dynamic that wasn't very favorable. And it was precisely, it was the pressure and the time constraints of the trials that led to have this format and to adopt this format. In 2020, remote interpreting already existed. Remote interpreting emerged actually about when the bandwidth came along, so the internet. And it was also rudimentary. Its beginning was very rudimentary, and it wasn't enough. But in 2020, just as in 1945, remote interpreting became absolutely necessary, and it was needed, and it was needed to put into practice. In 1945, they also had some skepticism. People would think that it wouldn't work, but the modality proved to work in quite well. And in 2020, there was also some hesitation because people and the people who organize events would start realizing that at least at the beginning, they would need to adhere to this new format, and they didn't know when would they be able to put a lot of people together in one single place. So yes, there was this hesitation. They didn't know how to make this proposal, how to do it exactly. So when we're talking about skepticism, I believe we can also bring this concept to remote interpreting. Just as back in the 30s, in the 40s, 20th century, people in their minds, they had like, they had their paradigm of thinking that it was just a consecutive interpreting. They would think that human beings didn't have the ability or the capacity to work in a different way with simultaneous interpreting. The parallelism is that when remote interpreting emerged, as I said, much before, a lot more before than the pandemic, there was this belief, and the belief was that if you're not in person, if the speakers and everyone who should be there is not there in the vision field of the interpreter, that it wouldn't be possible either. So this was what people believed. But it was because of the need that we needed to overcome this, and so we realized it was possible. So it brings us to the technology point, which is another parallelism between 1945 and 2020. The very important role that technology had. Without the technology in the equipments of 1945, simultaneous interpreting wouldn't be possible, and we wouldn't be here today. Likewise, technology was key for this new chapter that was inaugurated in our profession in 2020, because we already had some platforms that were dedicated for simultaneous interpreting, something that helped greatly with the initial chaos in the activities of our professions in 2020, was that the most important platforms were not necessarily platforms that were made for that. They were not platforms that were used for a multilingual public or audience. So this is why there were a lot of, they had to improve a lot. And there was all kind of arrangements and things that we had to do in order to do our job. And it was thanks to technology, it was thanks to our effort that we managed to stop doing these fixes and to really do it at a technological level. So we have amazing parallelisms. Just as in 2020, we can go back and see in 2020 and we think, oh my God, 2020. Zoom used to be the most spreaded platform, and it wouldn't allow us to make relay. I mean, the interpreters needed to use two computers and to connect and do some things. But it seems so far away now, 2020. Of course, we can go back, and we can go back to 1945, and we can do similar observations, because we can see the images of the booths when we see the Nuremberg trials, and we can see booths without the roof or the ceiling. I mean, the central of the interpreters was something very, I mean, the lack of it wasn't very neat. And we can say that the interpreter central didn't have the needed conditions. So there are many parallelisms when technology begins to solve a problem. It comes just very raw, right? And so, of course, there are other problems, but this is why we have to do this very important partnership between the human brain and the technological advancements. Let's move on to the next slide, please.
Not long after that time, some new speculations came to be. What is going to happen with interpreting when we go past the pandemic? What's going to be the new scenario? Are we going back to where we were before? Are we going back just to on-site meetings? I don't even think this is about only on-site meetings, but everything of what's going on of the on-site, if they're going to be the main meetings, because this is oversimplified what we have on the screen. But if we go back to the prior scenario that we're going to have more on-site meetings, would it be that when we pass the pandemic, everything is going to change? Remote interpreting is going to prevail. We're not going to have live meetings. Are we going to have a combination of both? Are we going to have both interpreting modalities, events? Is one going to be independent from the other? But there was not much time that went by when we realized that there was another scenario, hybrid meetings. That means those meetings where one part of the attendees is on site at the meeting. And when we see that other group of the attendees at the meeting are remotely connected. So what paradigm has prevailed for interpreting? We can see this is extremely dynamic, so much that when I put this presentation together for the FIT meeting in Varadero, the last phrase of which paradigm has prevailed was different. It was which paradigm is going to prevail. So in less than a year ago, we didn't even know how long was the pandemic going to last. I can just say that that meeting at Varadero was originally scheduled for 2020. It was postponed. It was moved down for 2 years. Here, we can see how much the pandemic had an influence in all of this. We can see that what was designed as a post-pandemic paradigm was hybrid meetings. Of course, I'm talking about not only about what I see, what my colleagues see, and what I have seen, what I have gone through in Brazil, but it is that currently it's not common to get to a meeting, work as an interpreter, and that everybody is there. No, we always have somebody that is connected from abroad or from another place that is connected online, unless it is a highly confidential meeting, maybe, where a video conference could be hindering the privacy. But besides that context, the meeting organizers have understood nowadays that it makes no sense to bring to the meeting so many experts, so many participants, to restrict them to a physical space. That's the legacy of the pandemic. That's the legacy of hybrid events, and also other implications. Let's talk once again about the role of technology. I can see that the use of technology in the post-pandemic period has implications that cover so many things. And as a matter of fact, we are about to see a huge change in the demographic dynamics of the interpreters. Before remote interpreting, when the meetings were only on site, the interpreter only needed to get to the meeting and to know how to control the console, to turn the microphone on, to turn it off, and then all of a sudden, just to use relay. And generally speaking, if they didn't need the relay, it was only about turning the microphone on, and then the technicians would arrive. The audio technicians that would come to help us with remote interpreting. That changed drastically, because us, we're inside our four walls at home, or if you had a interpreting hub, because we have an interpreter that is working from his or her cell. That person is going to be also performing, actions as a technician, because any technical problem, that person is going to have to solve that problem. So I asked myself, if that huge change is going to represent an incentive for those people that have been in the profession for a longer time, they have to start thinking about retirement, or on the contrary, that those people that are just starting in this profession, they have to realize that their profile has to go hand in hand with technology. So in that case, we have to realize that technology does offer that huge opportunity to alter the demographic dynamics of our profession. There's something else that is extremely important, and is the awareness of our clients with respect to the type of equipment that you must use and how to use that equipment. Because you have to realize that in live meetings, on-site meetings, the equipment provider is there. They know how to plug in, connect. They have qualified team to operate, to manage the equipment, to take care of any problems that may arise. But with remote interpreting, what we can see is that there's an unidentified number of people in different countries, in different places in the same country, and everybody arrives with their own piece of equipment. There's no control over that. And we know that technology can be extremely important for the quality of our work as interpreters. And I emphasize over and over the importance that as interpreters, when we are hired for remote interpreting, we have to perform a lot of work with the clients to bring awareness to the clients so the work is performed in the best possible way. And I usually say this, everything that is good for the interpreter is good for everyone, for everybody else. If we ask the speakers to use a headset, quality headset, not to use the integrated audio from the computer, because then we have more noise. That's good for the interpreter, but it's also very good for the rest of the participants at the meeting. And we also have to take care of something that is linked with technology, which is audiovisual, all the media that we see. And from the start of the pandemic, I have seen that in remote meetings, the situations where the speaker is not there. They're not always live while they wait for their recorded conference. And sometimes they send the conference, they edit the conference to use the time in a better manner. And for remote interpreting in real time, this is a huge challenge, because if we're not interpreting somebody that is speaking in the real time, that makes just normal pauses, and that may need a few seconds before they go to the next slide. All of this are great opportunities for the interpreter to be able to take a breath, to drink a sip of water, to get his or her mind organized. But if this is edited, this turns into a problem. It becomes a problem for us. And we have to pay attention to this, and we have to work with the clients so we can take care of this and solve any problems. So all of this are problems that the technology brings to the table. If we can go back to the prior slide, I have one more comment, please. Before we go to the next slide, as we face all of the situations, we need to have a reasonable level of flexibility and to understand that there are situations that we just can't put up with. I want to share with you about something that happened in 2020, 2021, in the midst of the pandemic. It was something that at that time, it really got me. But I also had to step back and say, hey, this is something that I cannot put up with. They have asked that I work as interpreter in a virtual event. There was a meeting with the health authorities in Brazil, some health authorities in Brazil, including the Minister of Health in Fortaleza, in the northeast part of Brazil. At that time, that state had become the epicenter of infection by COVID in Brazil. It was just devastating. And this meeting had been scheduled so we could discuss the guidelines and the actions to be taken. The Minister of Health in the city of Fortaleza was the person that they expected, to see. So he showed up. He had his cell phone inside a vehicle in the middle of traffic in order to give a presentation. Of course, that the audio was not the ideal, the quality of the equipment, the audio and everything was nothing that we could use, and it caused a lot of problems. I got very upset about the situation, but when the secretary arrived at the end of his presentation, that really, really hit me, because at the end of his presentation, he made the following comment. He said, I apologize because I was inside my car using my cell phone, but I was stuck in traffic when I was on my way to the meeting. I didn't want to cancel the meeting and I had to improvise. Then I really had to put everything behind. It was not something planned. It was something that he was not able to foresee. And that happened. So we need to take, take it easy and be patient and be able to guide our clients, tell them about everything that we need. But these things may happen. We cannot tell the clients, okay, you have to tell the participant that it's in the middle of the Amazons jungle, in the rainforest, or that is in the middle of the Saharan desert, that, that we're not going to interpret for him. We can't do that. So from now on, we're going to need to coordinate with the contracting parties so they understand how we perform our work. So we have a clear understanding of what we can do, ideally what we can do, and what we just can't. We are going through a time where we are we're creating this new paradigm. We're going to see a lot of situations that we could not foresee. What is the next hallmark in our profession? What is going to be the next thing that's going to happen? There's no question. The only thing we don't know is when. When is that going to happen? We had in 1945, we had the first paradigm from consecutives to simultaneous. And without that paradigm, we wouldn't have the profession that we have today. This would not exist. The possibility of having multiple languages in one single meeting and so many other things that we're doing nowadays. We get to 2020 and a pandemic just accelerated the process of bringing this virtual. What is the current rhythm of our profession? If the pandemic had not happened, coronavirus, this was in process, but very modest and in the not at a very high scale. The pandemic came to bring huge changes in our activities. The next step, we don't know what's going to happen. Automation. We don't know what's going to happen. And as I connect with Alan Melvick's words, as he spoke at the beginning, the profession is alive, is really alive. So I want to say our profession is alive and we will not be replaced. Well, I guess we will not be replaced so soon. What we currently see, all of this fireworks in the different companies that develop technologies, AI, even though they may seem impressive for good or for bad, most of them are showing advances in how they package the services, but not as much in the content of services. What do I mean about this? AI, artificial intelligence, is at a certain level of advances in 2023 that do not allow, it does not allow the machines to perform conference interpreter. They can use certain devices like what Google has launched and some others, like to visit Disney or maybe other place, maybe to buy ice cream or the pastry, maybe take a cab, but no more than that. Conference interpreting machine is not ready to work independent. What we have seen is improvements in the way that we package the services. We have a company that develops the technology for the machine to be able to reproduce the voice of the speaker in a different language. This is a package. This is not content, and this not represent advances in the understanding of the semantics of a technical conference. Nor a technical discussion. So we just need to be concerned about the full automation of our profession when artificial intelligence gets to the next level. What we see up to now, it's this GPT with the advanced and elaborated responses. It's impressive, but the machine does not think. Machines do not think yet. We will only be replaced when the machines understand, when they can feel the world, when the machine behaves as we say, as we see in the movies and sci-fi. Then we can, let the machines take over. Until then, we have not to be afraid. When will that happen? I don't know. I've heard speculations with respect to, at one point, the machines will reach the level of human intelligence and even go beyond. There's a technical term about that. That is singularity. Singularity is when the machine can be compared to a human in the cognitive and intellectual capacity, and that they can go beyond. When are we going to get to that singularity? We don't know. Some specialists say it's going to be 2030, some others 2040, and we don't know. Our generation, I think, has, it's still going to have a job. And the next generation, maybe 30 more years, it's going to be very difficult to try to foresee in the rhythm of technology what, we don't know what's going to happen in 5 years. It's going to be even worse for the next 5 or 30.
So once we went over this historical background with a pinch of foresight into the future, I would like to leave you some references with some very interesting books about the history of our profession, including not only books of history of simultaneous interpretation, but also of our sister profession, translation. Some of the books that I'm including here talk about both topics, translation and interpretation. For example, from out of the books we have here, some are very specific about simultaneous interpretation. For example, this one from Francesca Gaiva, 1998. It specifically has to do with the Nuremberg trials, and there are some other books that give context to the interpreter's profession in the space of other activities, such as the book from Ruth Roland from 1999. It is about interpretation within the context of diplomacy and politics. Very interesting books, all of them. The last one, Translators Through History, published by Jan Delisle and Judith Woodsworth. It mentions how during the Middle Ages, translators were key to help set languages in Europe within a context of a dictatorship of Latin in science and religion. It's a great reading. There are some other books. Next slide, please. In 2013, AIIC, celebrating 60 years of the association, that published the result of a research task force. And about 10 years before, also when they celebrated 50 years, they published this book that's about the history of the profession. It's also very interesting within the context of the creation of AIC and all the impact that it generated in the profession. It's extremely interesting. And here I mentioned the reference in French in the quote, but you can also find in English. It was published both in English and French. It's a classic now. The book From Jesus by Gori Halon, From Paris to Nuremberg. You might have noticed that the title of my conference is a wink to Jesus. It's an extremely interesting. The reading of this book is a great trip, and I wish to read it again. I read it a long time ago, but it explains in detail how this construction of the Odyssey that concluded in the Nuremberg trials, and it provides the whole context, political, and it also brings together the history of interpretation and brings it together with the history of what was happening back then. And all of these books are very interesting. We have new insights into the history of interpreting. It's a collection of papers. It is interpretation at different times in history in different parts of the world. It's also very interesting. And finally, we have two references to talk about the specific moment that I'm talking about. Regarding what's happening in the world, we can see one trial for 4 languages. It says, it talks about interpretation during the Nuremberg trials. And at this time that I'm talking, there's an exhibit in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and then it will go to Rio de Janeiro, and then we'll go to other cities and also other countries. I think it's already been across Europe, and now it came to America. In this website, we have there is information about the exhibit and the history of the Nuremberg trials, and then a very interesting resource for people who enjoy history. They can think for hours in this topic. It's called Looking for Interpreter Zero from Christine Adams. She's an AIC member, and these are a series of papers that talk about the interpreting activity in remote times in history and also more recent events. And so it's very interesting. These are papers that have maps, images, bibliographical references. It's really wonderful work from our colleague. I recommend that you visit this website in order to see all these very interesting materials for you. And so this is basically everything that I have. Next, please. And so this is what I have prepared to share with you. And I will be here in case you have any questions or you want to make some comments or ask for clarifications. If you would like to share some perceptions, if you some other similarities between 1945 and 2020 because I presented these two columns. This is something that can be expanded with more work if somebody has some different perception. I mean, we could be talking for hours about the implications of these paradigm shifts, which are huge regarding our profession. So I want to thank you, and I am here for your questions. Thank you very much. I would like to present something that I'm going to send to you. It is the book presented by the Colegio Mexicano de Conferencias, which is called On the Trail of a Profession, Conference Interpreting Mexico. It's a historical memoir that was done with memoirs of everyone of us who started since then. And we hope that it becomes a very interesting addition to your library. So we felt very happy and we enjoyed this presentation extremely. Maybe we could now have some comments. Monica, can you please help me to coordinate the questions? I believe we have many comments, and I want to thank English. I live in Canada, and I would like to have some connection, remote connection. The only people who are bisexual in North America, which we are both LATAM and North America, that's Mexico, and we're happy to do so. Could you please raise your hand, whoever is interested, so that we can give the floor? Monica, please. Sergio, there are several people or anyone who wants to ask a question, please show hands in the chat. We have congratulations for the interpreters. Thank you very much to everyone. Great interpretation. I don't see any hands raised. I don't see any. I would like to make a comment. Well, depending on the visual health, because Alan Melby is recently had eye surgery, but he's an expert in artificial intelligence, something Marcel mentioned, and he will be our third speaker after we have Elisa Calderon. She's German. She did some research on how the brain of interpreters work when it's just listening or when the interpreter is doing shadowing or interpreting through a scanner. That's going to be the next after Marcel. Marcel, you and I heard this conference together, I believe. And then we will have Alan Melby to talk about artificial intelligence. I think we have two hands raised, Berta Gomez and then Ernesto. Thank you very much. I'm really excited with the conference and also the excellent quality of the interpreters of Portuguese into Spanish. It was just wonderful. Now, my question, which is in the chat, is I'm interested to know about some Spanish-English program to study simultaneous interpretation. I do the third interpretation and also translator. I live in Calgary, Canada. I'm from Venezuela, and now I live in this passion. And any suggestion? Two colleagues made two suggestions. I already wrote them down. Thank you very much. My second question is, since I learned about this through LinkedIn, I would like to know how I can be included in your distribution list so that you invite me every time there's an event, because I was checking my LinkedIn and I saw the invitation. I copied the address, and that's why I joined today's presentation. And again, thank you very much. Excellent content. Excellent. I really loved it. Thank you very much. Well, please write down your email in the chat and we will write it down to include you in our mailing list. We have a complete series of presentations that we are going to have. Thank you, Berta. Next, I also say Antonio Porto, who raised his hand, but I don't know if he's still raising his hand. He would speak after Ernesto. So for now, Ernesto has the floor. I have a question for Marcel. Hello.
Marcel, would you prefer English or Español?
Español.
Okay.
Marcel, in one of your slides, you talk about tech savviness, a problem we've had that's very real in Mexico is of interpreters who have a lot of experience. They are older, they have a lot of experience, but they have not been able to join the world of remote simultaneous interpretation. So we are trying to bring them in, but we clearly see that there's an issue on learning the technology. Now the interpreter has to be someone who is learning technology. In the past, we had technicians who made sure that all the technology worked. You mentioned that, but the side where many are left behind, not because they are bad interpreters, but because they cannot manage the technology. So it's important to know the technology and do something about it. That's my question. Yes, Ernesto, I agree. I want to confess that I don't know much about the situation of what's happening in Brazil. I've had a very good opportunity between 2020 and 2021. I did work together with a colleague that you might know, Patricia Cabana. She is an interpreter, Italian interpreter. She works in Brazil, so we did some research with a Portuguese interpreter. And what is interesting is that we had no idea of how the investigation was going to be so interesting in the pandemic. The investigation during the pandemic was interesting and now being applied again in April of 2021. So during the pandemic, we had to make some adaptations. We included some of these situations in our research. What is the current reality of interpreting due to the change going from interpreting in person to remote interpreting? That's the idea of the question, the change of going from virtual to in-person interpreting. So suspension of activity, it's both possibilities. We were asking if those persons had resigned from the profession or if they had made a pause until the end of the pandemic. And out of 130 participants of interpreters, including Portuguese and other languages in Brazil, Europe, and North America, only one person said, I don't feel prepared to work in these modern times. That's why I'm retiring. Only one person said that. So from the point of view of this universe, out of 130 interpreters, very highly qualified interpreters, the research was disseminated in fora of highly qualified interpreters, and we were very impressed because I thought that that number would be higher. So I would really like to know what happened in the rest of the world, and also what could be done so that all these interpreters, highly experienced, don't get lost. And we have another item, Ernesto. This could be a new research that we could do, which would be to try to find out who joined the profession, who came in brand new after the pandemic, that somebody who became a professional interpreter thanks to be able to use the technology and have all the technology, and that person would not have become an interpreter without the pandemic. So we must remember that before the pandemic, the opportunities for people to become interpreters were very limited. You had to live in a city that had a good interpreting market, or not so much for many places. That will eliminate many people. If I take the reference Brazil, that has 27 states and 210 million inhabitants, but you find interpretation in Rio, Sao Paulo, Brasilia, and maybe a very small number of other cities. In order to be interpreting Brazil before the pandemic, you had to be in universe or about out of 500 cities, only in 30 cities there was an interpreting market. So I would love to know how this worked in the rest of the world. So we are experiencing a very interesting change, also very quiet of the interpreter's profile because of the pandemic. Now, what can we do? I don't know, in order to make these persons who have been interpreting for a long, long time and help them remain as interpreters. And I would like to know something else. It will also be a very interesting research. These persons who became interpreters during the pandemic, whose experience is mainly with remote interpreting, how will be their first events in presence, in person? Are they going to see it's more difficult? Very difficult. I prefer to work from home with my computer. It's a huge paradigm shift. Excellent comment. Now I would like to mention that something that you just said is very interesting. The problem we are having with remote interpretation with the recordings, we saw several issues, you and I, and we suffered this with Bander. I think that it would be great if through the feed and the side of interpretation with LATAM and North America, we develop an agreement to say, I don't interpret as you did with the guy who was calling on his phone from his car, because sometimes there's being a recording and we are the ones who get blamed for the poor quality of interpretation. And maybe Ernesto and Alma, maybe you should get Ernesto a movement in what conditions, in which situations we can tell the client when we can interpret and where we cannot interpret. There are many studies that have been done by Aikintas about toxic noise. So I believe that it's very important that as a group, before we are replaced by AI, but in the meantime, we have to check all of that. Monica, anyone else? Heidi Cases, and after Heidi, Hilda Tejada. Heidi, you have the floor. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here and to listen. I love Marcel when you said that we have to educate our customers, and we have to educate the customers, and we have to educate ourselves. And there's a huge opportunity in front of us, because since this is just beginning and we saw with the pandemic, we have the control of the situation because we know. And so when the customer comes, you tell them this how things are, because you are the person who knows. And something we saw here, I work in the US, something that we saw with the beginning of the pandemic and the opportunity to educate the customers, but also we have to establish guidelines to say how we should work and what to do. It would be very interesting to share between different regions, different countries, what we have done, what has worked, what we still need. Last was mentioned, what do you do with situations, not with recordings, because now with Zoom, it can record the interpretation automatically. So what do you do with the customer if an interpreter? You will also be technician, and on top of the interpreter, all these things. I think it's extremely important to see what we're doing in different situations and what are the challenges. So I believe that it's very interesting. That's why I loved listening to you, because I know that the proposal of the conferences of the comic is very interesting, but I would like to hear the opinion and what's happening in other countries. And that's what I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much. Now, regarding the episode of the Health Secretary of Health, who was the most important person in the meeting, who was talking from his car by phone, I did interpretation. I didn't refuse to do that interpretation. I was quite upset, of course, and I thought I'm going to say something to the company or person who heard me, but when the Secretary of Health explained why he did what he did, I said, no, I'm not going to make any complaint, and I feel grateful with myself because I didn't stop interpreting. Now, what I cannot tell you is where can we draw that line between what is possible and what is not possible. Now, the CEO of the company who is in his high-tech office with all the technology and uses his computer microphone doesn't deserve any mercy. He should know that in order to participate in the meeting, he would have to use better equipment. Of course, it's different to the example that I mentioned before of this man who was in his car. We have to work very much on the side of flexibility and understand the possible scenarios in order to be able to say, no, this is not acceptable and this is an exception. We are going to do what is possible. There could be some problems, but this is within what we can do. Hello, thank you. Good evening. Hello, everyone. Something that I have decided to say when conditions are not adequate.
The conditions were not good for the interpretation. We say on the microphone, we are going to restart the interpretation when we had the proper conditions. And I turned my mic off. There hasn't been a single time in which they stop, in which they haven't stopped the event to fix the mic of the speaker. I mean, I think this is something that has to do with self-respect. I mean, you want to be the hero, you want to save the event no matter what. I'm going to sacrifice myself. I don't want them to kick me off the meeting. They won't do it. You have to respect yourself. Do it professionally. Sometimes the audio cannot be fixed if you are out on the field, if you're in the midst of an armed conflict. Of course, you cannot do it. But if we are in a context of conference interpreting, where the people, it's supposed to be ready there to talk, to speak, to make a presentation, there's no excuse for them not to have a good audio or for people not to take it seriously. Once there was a person, I was in Madrid, it was here day and there was night there, and he was going back from the party and he was like, I'm coming back from the party, and he thought it was very funny, and he was taking the phone call. So I was like, this is not good for interpreting, and I turned my mic off and they fixed it. I believe that as interpreters, we have to be well documented and we have to have it clear, know what our conditions, our minimal standard conditions should be to work. And what we have to do is we have to do this even, we have to do it all at the same level, because the moment somebody accepts something and somebody else wants to be a hero, somebody says, well, I'm not so picky, I'm not so, complicated as the man there. So the moment we start doing this, we start sending cross messages, and the only way in which we're going to get respect and adherence and treatment and for our profession, for ourselves as professionals if we send out a clear and direct message that is always the same. Thank you so much. Thank you. I completely agree with you. And Marcel mentioned this clearly when they are talking and they have a phone in a car in movement, we can do it. But what happens with this trend that was also mentioned by Marcel, that we are interpreting with records, with recorded presentations. I mean, and they usually just put in the presentation and the recording, and you have to go at that pace, and there's no other thing but to edit, and we have to stop it, and we have to think about these things. And this is something that it's worth educating interpreters on. Of course, also the clients, but also the interpreters, and for us to have guidelines to know what to do. Okay, Hilda says some of them want to become the hero, some of them won't do it, but they are recording this. And this is another problem. We don't even have the rights of there, and they use those recordings for other things. So they are taking work away from us, and also for translators, because with artificial intelligence, they have it even harder. And there are other scenarios as well, Sergio. This is when the client sends the recordings out. They are not going to use this in a real event, but they want the interpretation to be recorded. So what is the criteria that you'll be using? Are you going to charge as an interpreting job? You shouldn't, because if we're going to record it, it's going to take you longer, right? You're going to listen to it, you're going to listen it again, you're going to edit it, you have to record it again. It's another reality. All of these new technological media are opening up a lot of possibilities, and we have to get ready for this. And in this way, to be all aligned, okay? Hopefully we could all come to an agreement and to align everything, because we're going to have a lot of parameters that won't be beneficial for our profession. Do we have somebody else, Monica?
No, ya no veo más.
No, I don't see any more
personas.
hands. I don't see any. Wait, yes, we have Marcelo Andreotti. Marcelo, you have the floor. Good evening. Great event. Thank you so much. There is something that I even put it on the chat. Or a lot of business meetings that we had to translate. There is only one console in the center of the table where a lot of people are discussing the interpretation, and they're even just speaking to that single microphone. They're not using individual microphones. This is a very difficult situation in which the sound's not good, and it is hard because they're all listening from the same console, from the same equipment. So how do you feel? What do you feel in this regard? Has this happened to you? Good evening, Marcelo. Thank you for being here. Thank you for participating as well. Yes, it has happened to me. When I'm hired for a meeting with this type of formats, I try to bring, I'm not sure how they call it. I'm not even know the name in Portuguese. This is like a star that you put like in the middle part of it, even if you're not in the booth, even using the portable device. You like put that star on the table and you plug it so that it can transmit to your own headset, and this is going to improve the audio. We have another comment from Gabriela, but we have no more. Can you see them? Thank you, Marcel. And just to remind you, we have this book here. This is the history of Mexico. Marcel, I'll be sending this to you. I need your address to send you this later on, because this is important for us. we made a meeting. It was called OPI. It's the itinerant memory of people who are living. It was OPI, from office to from trade to profession. I think this can give you a lot of light at the way it changed from trade to profession. They were telling us we would do the interpretation first and then the voiceover in order to have it all. And now we do it all directly. We have the translation. They will always translate it and transcribe it, and it was a whole process, and we don't do that anymore. Any other comments, Monica? No, I don't believe we have any other comments. So we're just in time, an hour and a half. Do we still have Alan with us? Or is he out?
Alan,
no
I
lo
don't
veo.
see him.
is still there?
Alan, yes, he is
Sí,
there.
aquí
Yes.
está.
Yes. Could you close
Say-
our first webinar of your presidential period, sponsored by the Mexican region and the Mexican Colegio Mexicano de Intérpretes de Conferencias? Wishing you a good recovery on your bionic eyes. You still there? Hello?
So I want to thank you for this marvelous evening. I enjoyed it so much. The presentation, the content, the interpreting, the feeling, as we say in French, the ambiance, the whole event. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And the ambiance was great. You know, it's always sunny Mexico and sunny Brazil.
Monica, is there something else? That would be it. I'm not sure whether Alma or Ernesto have some closing words. No, thank you so much, Marcel. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was very interesting. It's a very broad topic that I'm sure we haven't yet solved. Thank you so much for that. Thank you, Marcel. I believe the intention that we had, it was achieved. It was to be able to establish a pathway, so to know where we're heading so that our profession doesn't disappear. I believe you have given us tools, you have given us material, and to think, you have given us, they say in English, food for thought. And I believe that from now on, we have to fight not from different points. We have to fight from a common point. As Heidi was saying, if we don't agree on things, or as Ilda was saying, we are going to be at more danger, I mean, of losing our profession. So remember that now with remote interpreting, we do not have to look what we need for. Locally, we can interpret, we can get the best interpreter of Portuguese that could be in Brasilia, could be in Rio, could be in Minas Gerais, or it could be in Mexico. Or we can get a Latin American Spanish that is neutral, maybe from Colombia, maybe, and people, it doesn't matter anymore. The local market doesn't have the importance that it used to have, as you said, Marcel. So I believe that what you're opening also is the need, you're opening us for the need to rethink about interpretation. For them to, retrain, so they can train themselves over and over again so that they can work on the problems that we have with the future generations and the elder generations that don't know how to adapt themselves for this new type of interpreting. I think you have opened up a good scenario, and we want to thank you. Our presentation for today will be included in our YouTube channel for the Colegio Mexicano de Intérpretes de Conferencia, and we'll have the version of all 4 languages, because we recorded all 4 languages without asking the interpreters for permission, just by thanking them. But we have the original in Portuguese and all the interpretations. What I'm speaking in Spanish, we have it in French, and we have it in English. And I want to thank again Mariela Andrade, Gabriel Meneman, Gabriela Clefi, Francisco Javier López Islas, Ana Cortés, Lorena Rincón, who's not here, and Andan Vallejo and Diana Ollán for their interpretation pro bono. This is the way in which we can show how the Colegio Mexicano de Intérpretes de Conferencias is committed with LAFIT, so we can work with our colleagues. And we want to thank also Helen for the support that she gave us technically. She was our assistant. Helen Lopez, thank you so much. We can close now. Marcel, do you want to give any final comments so that we can say goodbye? Thank you again. I just want to reiterate how thankful I am for your invitation. It was a great honor to be with you here in this ambiance during this hour and a half. Thank you so much, Sergio, for the invitation. I want to thank again the CEMIC and LAFIT North America. I'll be here to participate in the upcoming conferences, and I hope to see you briefly at an in-person Congress. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night, and we're full house. We achieve our mission. Thank you so much. Have a good evening and have a wonderful spring, or down in the Southern Cone. You have now the summer, right? Going on. Well, have an excellent time. Thank you. Good evening, Monica. Do you want to say anything else? No. Good evening. Thank you.